For most people, the scent of gingerbread and cinnamon is a fleeting holiday memory. For me, it's the scent of sanctuary. It's the smell of my grandmother's house, and for all of my 20 years, it has been the only thing that ever meant. I was truly honed out my name as Caria. At Georgetown Law, I am a fortress of logic and ambition, a persona I built for survival. But when my beat-up Honda Civic turns onto Maple Hill Drive, that fortress dissolves. I become the girl who knows which porch step groans, the one whose tension melts away in the humid Virginia air, thick with the scent of my grandmother's prize-winning roses. This house, with its robin's egg blue shutters, is where Eleanor lives. In many ways, she is the one who raised me. The front door swings open before I can knock. She stands there, a silhouette against the warm light, her smile a beautiful roadmap of a life well lived. "There's my girl," she says, her voice a low, comforting melody dot, and then I'm enveloped. A hug from my grandmother isn't a gesture. It's an event. It smells of yeast, cinnamon, and clean ivory soap, and wordlessly communicates, "You are safe here. You can stop fighting now." I bury my face in her shoulder, feeling the armor I wear every day crumble into dust. Here I am, just Caria again. I remember at age 8, running to her after a boy pushed me from the swings. My knee was bleeding, but the real wound was the casual indifference I'd met at my own home, a house then filled with the smoke and noise of my parents' amateur poker phase. My father grunted, "Walk it off," while my mother, annoyed, told me not to drip on the carpet. I ran the 3 blocks here. Eleanor didn't fuss. She simply cleaned my wound, sat me at her heavy oak kitchen table, and placed a glass of milk and 2 warm gingerbread men before me. The quiet care, the undivided attention it healed more than my knee. It mended the cracks in my 8-year-old heart. That silence, that sense of order, is why I chose to study law. My life with my parents was a storm of unpredictability, of soaring highs and devastating lows funded by abstract luck and credit. I craved a system where actions had logical consequences. The law, with its intricate structure and authoritative statutes, became my chosen language. It was my attempt to build a world for myself that could never be shaken. "You look thin," my grandmother says now, herding me toward the kitchen. It's her standard diagnosis for any ailment. "We need to fix that. Sit." I sink into a familiar chair in the heart of her home. The kitchen is warm and bright, with copper-bottomed pots hanging from a rack and jars of homemade preserves lining the shelves like jewels. Cooling on the counter is a fresh batch of gingerbread, the source of that divine, welcoming smell. She pours me a tall glass of iced tea. I tell her about my classes, about the relentless pace, but I leave out the gnawing loneliness. I don't mention the phone calls from my parents, their voices either manically cheerful or sharp with a desperation that always preceded a vague request for money. I will not bring their storm into this harbor. "Your mother called earlier," she says, her back to me as she arranges cookies on a plate. The walls inside me go up instantly. "Oh?" I ask, my voice carefully neutral. "They're in Atlantic City again. Some kind of tournament?" She turns, and a flicker of weariness crosses her face before she smooths it away. "She said to tell you she loves you." The words are right, but they feel hollow, a script recited from memory. Love from them had become a currency. I force a smile. "That's nice." My grandmother doesn't press. She knows. She simply places the plate on the table between us. I pick up a gingerbread man with a lopsided smile piped in icing. The first bite is an explosion of spice and molasses, a taste so deeply interwoven. With my identity, it feels more real than my own reflection. This is my sanctuary. This little kitchen, this unwavering woman. For the next 3 months, I will let the ordered peace of this house seep into my bones. Here, on Maple Hill, the chaos can't reach me. Here, I am safe. At least that's what I tell myself. First few days at my grandmother's house passed in a blissful, quiet rhythm. We fell into an easy routine dictated by the sun and the needs of the garden, but the past is never truly gone. It lives in the corners of old houses. One afternoon, while looking for a book in the living room, I found it tucked away on a bookshelf, a heavy leather-bound photo album. Its pages were filled with ghosts. I sat on the floor, the thick pages whispering as I turned them. And there they were, a photo of my parents, taken nearly 15 years ago at a county fair. They looked impossibly young. My father, Richard, had his arm around my mother, Maria. He wasn't the gaunt, haunted man I knew today. His shoulders were broad under a simple flannel shirt, and he was smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He looked solid, dependable. Like the houses he used to build. My father's hands were once his entire story. They were calloused and perpetually scarred with small nicks and cuts, but they were incredibly capable. I remember the smell of sawdust that clung to him when he'd come home, a scent as comforting to me than as my grandmother's gingerbread. He could fix anything, my broken bicycle chain, a loose cabinet door, a leaky faucet. He taught me how to properly hold a hammer, his large hand gently guiding mine. There was a quiet pride in his work, a satisfaction he took from creating something tangible and lasting from a pile of lumber. Measure twice, cut once, Caria, he'd say, a simple mantra for a life built on precision and effort. My mother, in the photograph, was vibrant. Her laugh was always a little too loud, filling every room she was in. She worked as a hairdresser, and her home used to smell of hairspray and the sweet, chemical scent of salon shampoo. She'd come home with endless stories about her clients, spinning tales of neighborhood drama with a theatrical flair that held me captive. Her dream was to one day open her own salon, Maria's, with a big, glamorous sign out front. She had a passion for beauty, for making things bright and colorful, whether it was a client's hair or the cheap but cheerful curtains she hung in our windows. We were a family then. Imperfect, certainly, but whole. Friday night was pizza night, eaten on TV trays while we watched a movie. We weren't wealthy, but we had traditions. Every October, we'd go to the state fair, the very one in the photograph. My father would win me a giant stuffed animal at a rigged carnival game, spending $20 with grim determination just to see me smile. My mother would drag us on every rickety ride, her screams of delight mixing with my own. Looking at the photo now, I can see the seeds of what was to come, hidden in plain sight. I see the restless energy in my mother's eyes, the way she looked at the more expensive houses we drove past with a sigh of longing. I remember my father late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bills, his face tight with a worry that his hard work could never quite erase. They loved me, and they loved each other, but they were dreamers trapped in a life that felt too small. They always wanted more, a little more money, a little more excitement, a little more luck. They felt that their hard work entitled them. To it. I gently closed the heavy cover of the album. The ghosts receded, leaving me in the quiet, sun-drenched living room. The man with the capable hands and the woman with the boisterous laugh felt like characters from a book I'd read a long time ago. Fictional people with no connection to the desperate strangers who are my parents now. The memory left a bittersweet ache in my chest, a profound sadness for what was lost. Putting the album back on its shelf felt like burying them all over again. Outside, I could hear the gentle snip of my grandmother's shears as she tended to her roses, a steady, comforting sound in the silence they left behind. The change didn't happen overnight, but the catalyst was a single thunderous event. It started, as most tragedies do, with a moment of incredible luck. My mother, on a whim while paying for gas, bought a $2 lottery ticket. It was a slip of paper she tossed onto the cluttered dashboard of her car and forgot about for 3 days. I was 15 when she found it, crumpled under a pile of old receipts. I was in the kitchen doing homework when I heard the shriek, a sound so sharp and piercing I thought someone had been hurt. I ran into the living room to find her staring at the ticket in her hand, her face pale with shock. My father grabbed it from her, his eyes scanning the numbers again and again. Then a slow, disbelieving grin spread across his face, and he let out a roar of pure, unadulterated triumph. They were dancing, spinning around the living room, laughing with a kind of hysterical joy I had never seen before. The number on the ticket was $200 000 to us. It felt like all the money in the world. It was the answer to every late-night argument over bills, every wistful sigh over a vacation we couldn't afford. For the first week, it was magical. My father walked off his construction site in the middle of the day and never went back. My mother called the salon owner she worked for and quit on the spot. Maria's is going to be a spa now, not just some little salon, she declared, her eyes shining with ambition. The first purchase was a brand new luxury sedan, a car far too flashy for our modest neighborhood. Then came the celebration. It started with a trip to Atlantic City, just for the weekend, they promised, to feel what it's like to be rich. They came back with stories of complimentary champagne, sprawling hotel suites, and the intoxicating thrill of the high-limit tables. They'd lost some money, my mother admitted with a giggle, but they'd also won a small jackpot. It was exhilarating. The weekend trip bled into the next week, and then the next month. The dream of Maria's spa was quickly replaced by talk of hot streaks and systems. The language of our house began to change. My father, who once spoke of wood grains and building codes, now spoke of odds and dealer tells. His pride was no longer in what his hands could build, but in how much he could win. My mother's vibrant energy, once channeled into neighborhood gossip and hairstyles, became a manic, obsessive focus on the roulette wheel. The smell of sawdust and the dream of Maria's spa was quickly replaced by talk of hot streaks and systems. The language of our house began to change. My father, who once spoke of wood grains and building codes, now spoke of odds and dealer tells. His pride was no longer in what his hands could build, but in how much he could win. My mother's vibrant energy, once channeled into neighborhood gossip and hairstyles, became a manic, obsessive focus on the roulette wheel. The smell of sawdust and hairspray was replaced by the stale, clinging scent of casino smoke on their expensive new clothes. The $200,000 that was meant to be our foundation became quicksand, and we were sinking fast. Asterisk, 5 years had passed since that winning ticket altered our family's trajectory. 5 years of a long, slow decline that I had watched from a distance, first from my high school classroom, and now from the hallowed halls of Georgetown Law. Every visit home had felt like visiting a foreign country whose customs were growing, stranger and more unsettling. This summer, after finishing my grueling first-year exams, I returned with a familiar sense of dread knotted in my stomach. I drove to my parents' house first. It was the same house I'd grown up in, but it felt like a cheap replica. The flower beds my mother once tended were choked with weeds. Inside, the air was still and stuffy. An enormous flat-screen television, one of their first extravagant purchases, played silently in the corner, casting a flickering blue light over dusty furniture. It felt less like a home and more like a hotel room after the occupants had checked out. They emerged from their bedroom looking like faded photographs of themselves. My father was thinner, his solid frame now wiry and tense. His eyes, once clear and direct, were shifty and bloodshot. My mother's famous laugh was gone, replaced by a tight, brittle smile. She was wearing silk pajamas in the middle of the Afternoon, a new diamond ring on her finger that seemed to weigh her hand down. Caria. Honey, you're here, she said, her voice thin. The hug she gave me was brief and bony. How were your finals? My father asked, but his eyes were already drifting toward the window, as if expecting someone. I tried to tell them about my classes, about a particularly challenging constitutional law exam, but their attention was fractured. They spoke to each other in short, whispered phrases I couldn't catch. Their phones buzzed incessantly. The easy comfort of family was gone, replaced by the tense, guarded atmosphere of a deal about to go wrong. I was an interruption, a complication in a narrative I wasn't privy to. After an hour of stilted conversation, I couldn't stand it anymore. I'm going to head over to Grandma's, I announced. A flicker of something relief passed over my mother's face. Okay, sweetie. We'll see you for dinner later. Maybe. Driving the familiar streets to Maple Hill, I tried to push the unease away. I was just tired. They were just stressed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the foundation had cracked for good. I craved the solid ground of my grandmother's house, the one place that was constant, the one anchor in my churning world. I pictured her opening the door, the scent of gingerbread and safety washing over me, and for a few minutes my anxiety subsided. I turned the corner onto her street, a smile finally forming on my face, but it vanished instantly. My blood ran cold. There, staked brazenly into the immaculate green lawn my grandmother tended with such care, was a large professional sign. On it, in bold red letters, were 4 words that made no sense, 4 words that felt like a violent physical blow. For sale by owner? For a long moment, I just sat in my car, the engine ticking quietly as it cooled. The world outside the windshield seemed to warp, the bold red letters of the for sale sign shimmering in the summer heat. It felt like a hallucination, a signifier of a universe that had tilted off its axis. This was my grandmother's house. This was the sanctuary. Sanctuaries weren't for sale. My first thought, a desperate one, was that it was a mistake. Some realtor had put the sign on the wrong lawn. It had to be. I finally forced myself out of the car, my legs feeling unsteady, as if the ground itself had become unreliable. Every step up the familiar gravel path was a battle against a rising tide of dread. The cheerful blue shutters seemed to mock me. The blooming roses, which I had been so eager to see, now looked like decorations at a funeral. I used my key, a metal cool and solid in my trembling hand, and stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. The comforting scent of gingerbread was faint, overpowered by the smell of lemon-scented polish, as if my grandmother had been cleaning. Obsessively, she was in the living room, sitting in her favorite armchair, not reading or knitting, but just staring at the wall. She looked smaller than she had just a few hours ago when I'd imagined her. She looked fragile. Grandma? I said softly. She jumped, startled. A pained, almost guilty, look crossed her face before she replaced it with a watery smile. Caria, I didn't hear you come in. I walked over, my heart pounding against my ribs. I knelt in front of her chair, taking her cool, dry hands in mine. Grandma, what's going on? There's a sign on your lawn. Her eyes darted away, unable to meet mine. Oh, that, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's nothing to worry about, dear. Your mother and father were here yesterday. They said it was just a formality. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. A formality for what? For helping me, she said, reciting words that were clearly not her own. They're worried about me all alone in this big house. They said it would be easier for them to manage my finances, to help with the property taxes and upkeep. If their names were on the paperwork too. They said it was for the best. The words were so slick with false concern, so perfectly crafted to prey on her trust that I felt a surge of hot, pure rage, but I kept my voice even. What? Paperwork, Grandma? Did you sign something? She hesitated, then nodded, a gesture of shame. They brought some papers. They said it was just to refinance, to get a little extra money out for a new roof. They had a notary with them and everything. It all happened so fast. My mind, the mind I was training to be a lawyer's, was racing, refinancing, managing. Finances. None of that required a for sale sign. None of it required a notary for a simple discussion. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of such calculated cruelty it took my breath away. Where are the papers? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Do you have a copy? She shuffled to the old wooden secretary desk in the corner and pulled out a thin manila folder. My hands shook as I took it from her. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a standard loan application, mostly blank. It was the second one that made my blood freeze. The heading at the top was unmistakable, a phrase I had seen a dozen times in my property law textbook. Quitclaim deed. It wasn't a refinancing document. It wasn't a power of attorney. It was an instrument of absolute surrender. A quitclaim deed transfers any interest a person has in a property to someone else. It is the fastest way to give a house away. I scanned the legal text, my eyes catching on the key phrases. For the sum of $1 and other good and valuable consideration, does hereby remise, release, and forever quitclaim unto. And there, listed as the grantees, were their names, Richard and Maria Collins. My parents' dot at the bottom was my grandmother's signature, her familiar, elegant script looking shaky and uncertain. And next to it, the crisp, embossed seal and unforgiving signature of a notary public. It was legal. It was binding. It was a confession of betrayal, signed and sealed. A low sound escaped my throat. My grandmother looked at me, her face etched with a dawning fear. Caria, what is it? Is something wrong? I slowly lowered the paper, the weight of it feeling immense. How could I explain this? How could I tell this woman that her own daughter and son-in-law, the people she trusted implicitly, had just stolen her home from under her? I took a deep breath. Grandma, I started, my voice trembling with suppressed fury. This isn't a refinancing paper. This is a deed. It means you sign the house over to them. Legally, they own it now, not you. The color drained from her face. She sank back into her chair, her hand flying to her mouth. The confusion in her eyes slowly cleared, replaced by the devastating, soul-crushing clarity of betrayal. She didn't cry out. She didn't sob. She just made a small, wounded sound, the sound of a heart breaking dot in that moment. Something inside me shifted. The student, the scared granddaughter, fell away. The grief and shock in my heart didn't disappear, but they hardened, crystallizing into a cold, sharp resolve. This was no longer just a family problem. This was a crime. They had used legal documents as a weapon against the most vulnerable person I knew. They had breached the walls of my sanctuary, and I was going to use the very law they twisted to make it right. My purpose had never been clearer. I wasn't just here to comfort my grandmother. I was here to fight for her. And my first stop would be confronting the monsters who had put that sign on her lawn. Asterisk rage is a cold thing. It didn't burn in my chest. It crystallized in my veins as I drove from my grandmother's house, the fraudulent deed sitting on the passenger seat like a coiled snake. Every instinct screamed at me to floor the gas, to storm in and unleash the full force of my fury. But the law student, the person I had been so painfully forging, took control. Emotion was a weakness, evidence was power, and I was holding the evidence in my hand. When I reached my parents' house, I didn't bother to knock. I used my key and walked in. They were in the living room, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. My mother was pacing, wringing a silk scarf in her hands. My father stood by the window, staring out at the street with the wariness of a hunted animal. They flinched when they saw me. Caria, my mother began, forcing a bright smile. "You're back so soon. Let's skip the performance." I cut her off, my voice so cold and foreign it startled even me. I walked to the coffee table and slapped down the quitclaim deed. I want an explanation, not the lies about helping Grandma. I want to know why you stole her house. My father turned from the window, his face a dark cloud. "You don't know what you're talking about? This is adult business." "I'm a first-year law student," I countered, meeting his gaze directly. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. This is fraudulent commands. You deceived an 80-year-old woman into signing away her only asset. That's not just adult business, it's a felony." The word felony hung in the air. My mother flinched. "We did not," she insisted, but her voice trembled. "We're protecting her. The house is too much for her. We were going to sell it and get her someplace smaller, safer." "Safer?" I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "What do you know about safety? You haven't known a safe day in years. Safety is what you destroyed, one Vegas trip, one lost bet at a time. She was the only safe thing I had, and you put a for sale sign on her as if she were just another item in a pawn shop." Asterisk, my composure was starting to crack. The tremor in my mother's voice, the flicker of raw desperation in my father's eyes, it was more than just greed. It was deeper, uglier. "This isn't just about gambling money anymore, is it?" I pressed, looking from one to the other. "The 200,000 is long gone. What is really going on?" That's when my father made his mistake. "You need to leave now," he said, his voice hoarse with panic as he took a step toward me. "There are things you shouldn't be involved in." My eyes swept over him, and then I saw it. A dark, almost black bruise on the inside of his elbow, revealed for a split second as he reached out. A track mark. And suddenly, everything made sense. The weight loss, the bloodshot eyes, the frantic, manic energy hidden just beneath the surface, the uncontrollable tremor in my mother's hands. It wasn't stress. It was withdrawal, without another word. I turned and walked directly toward their bedroom. "Caria, stop." My mother shrieked behind me. "Don't go in there." But I was already through the door. The room was a mess, clothes strewn everywhere. But I wasn't looking at the clutter. I was looking for their secret. On a horrifying hunch, I dropped to my knees and looked under the bed. There, shoved into the darkest corner, was an old shoebox. I pulled it out. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside wasn't casino chips or stacks of bills. Inside was their own private hell. There were several used syringes, a burnt spoon with black residue, and multiple small plastic baggies, some still holding a dusting of white powder. Nausea rose in my throat. The scene was so cheap, so pathetic. My parents, who had dreamed of luxury resorts and high roller tournaments, had sunk to this, but that wasn't all. Underneath the sordid paraphernalia was a sheaf of papers demand letters, but these weren't credit card notices. These were menacing, typewritten notes with no return address. They didn't talk about interest rates. They talked about shipment, delays, and severe consequences, and then I saw the numbers. Strings of zeros that followed one another into an abyss. Figures that added up to an impossible debt, a financial hole so deep no jackpot could ever fill it. The final number, circled in red ink at the bottom of the most recent letter, sucked the air from my lungs. $1 million. I rose slowly, the shoebox in my hands. I walked back out of the bedroom, feeling as though I were moving through someone else's dream. They stood there, frozen, their faces a mask of shame and absolute terror. I didn't have to say a word. The evidence was right there in my hands. The betrayal of my grandmother's house had been agonizing. But this was more. This was a complete collapse. They weren't just gamblers. They were addicts. And they didn't just owe money to casinos. They had shackled themselves to something so dangerous that stealing an old woman's home had seemed like their only rational choice. My cold rage was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrifying emptiness. The problem was no longer how to get that house back. The problem was that my parents were on a collision course with their own destruction, and they were taking all of us down with them. I looked at their faces, two strangers drowning in a nightmare of their own making, and I realized my fight had only just begun. Asterisk, I don't remember driving back to my grandmother's house. The 10-minute journey exists in my memory only as a blur of green trees and gray asphalt, a silent movie playing outside the window of my own personal horror film. I walked into the sanctuary that no longer felt safe, murmured something incoherent to my grandmother about needing to lie down, and shut myself in the small guest room that had been my refuge since childhood. There, the fortress I had so carefully constructed around my heart didn't just crumble. It was annihilated. I curled into a ball on the bed, buried my face in a pillow that smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, and I broke. The sobs were violent and soundless, racking my body in waves of grief and terror. I cried for the little girl who had adored her capable, hardworking father. I cried for the vibrant, laughing mother who had been erased by a desperate, hollowed-out addict. I cried for my grandmother, whose trust had been so cruelly weaponized against her. And I cried for myself, for the 20-year-old law student who was supposed to have answers, but was now faced with a problem so monstrously complex that every possible solution felt like a different kind of damnation. As night fell, the tears subsided, leaving behind a cold, desolate clarity. The house was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking a second closer to a disaster I had to somehow prevent. I lay awake, staring into the darkness, my mind a courtroom where two opposing counsels argued for the fate of my family. On one side was the daughter. Her voice was full of desperate hope. "There has to be another way," she pleaded. "We can get them into rehab. We can talk to them, reason with them. We can sell their car, their jewelry. We can find a way to pay back a portion of the debt, negotiate a settlement." The daughter argued from a place of love, clinging to the ghosts of the parents I remembered from the photo album. She wanted to believe they were still in there, trapped beneath the layers of addiction and deceit, waiting to be rescued by their child. But her arguments were flimsy, built on emotion rather than fact. How do you reason with addiction? How do you negotiate with drug traffickers who are owed $1 million? Her path was the path of denial, a path that would lead to all of us, me, my grandmother, my parents being consumed by the fire they had started. On the other side was the law student. Her voice was cold, pragmatic, and utterly brutal in its logic. She cross-examined the daughter's arguments with ruthless efficiency. "Rehab costs money we don't have, and they won't go willingly," she stated. "Their addiction makes them incapable of rational thought. Any money you give them will go to drugs. And the people they owe $1 million to do not have a customer service department. They deal in violence and fear." The law student argued that my parents were no longer just a family problem. They were a criminal enterprise. They were engaged in conspiracy, fraud, and drug trafficking. The only logical, effective way to stop a criminal enterprise is to involve the authorities. Her argument was simple. The law is the only tool powerful enough to stop this. The daughter recoiled in horror. "You want to send them to prison? Your own mother and father? You want to be the one who puts them in a cage? Prison has mandatory drug rehabilitation programs," the law student countered calmly. Prison will protect them from the people they owe. Money, too. It will protect them from themselves. Most importantly, it will protect Grandma. It is the only option that contains the damage and offers any chance, however slim, of their survival. All night, they fought. The daughter wept for her lost family, while the law student built an airtight case. I felt torn in two, the emotional pull of my love for them warring with the ice-cold logic of my training. To save them, I had to betray them. To love them, I had to destroy them. It was a monstrous, impossible choice. The first pale light of dawn began to filter through the window, tracing the patterns on the old wallpaper. I looked around the room, at the familiar furniture, the bookshelf filled with the books of my childhood. I thought of my grandmother sleeping peacefully in the next room, oblivious to the war raging inside me, trusting that I would handle it. And in that moment, the verdict came in. The daughter lost. Love couldn't be blind trust and endless second chances anymore. Love had to be this, a terrible, wrenching act of tough, brutal mercy. The most loving thing I could do for my parents was to force them to stop. The law wasn't just a tool for punishment. In this case, it was the only form of salvation available. It was a cage, yes, but it was a cage that might save their lives. A grim, heavy certainty settled over me. The emotional storm had passed, leaving a landscape of quiet resolve. I was no longer just their daughter. I was the only person with the knowledge and the will to see this through to its logical, heartbreaking conclusion. I swung my legs out of bed. My body felt heavy, as if I had aged a decade overnight. I walked to the window and watched the sun rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was a beautiful, peaceful morning, a stark contrast to the ugly decision I had just made. I knew with uncertainty that chilled me to the bone that nothing would ever be beautiful or peaceful in the same way again. I picked up my phone from the nightstand, my thumb hovering over the numbers for the county police department. There was no going back. The county police station was a squat brick building that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. The fluorescent lights in the lobby hummed with an indifferent buzz, casting a sterile greenish light on the scuffed linoleum floors. It was a world away from the sun-drenched, emotional chaos of my life, and for that, I was grateful. This place operated on procedure and fact, the very things I now clung to like a life raft. When I told the officer at the front desk I needed to speak with a detective about a major fraud and drug-related issue, I did so in a voice so devoid of emotion it felt like someone else's. I was led to a small, cluttered office and introduced to a man named Detective Miller. He was in his late 40s, with tired eyes that had seen too much, and a cheap suit that looked like he'd slept in it. He gestured for me to sit and listen patiently, his face unreadable, as I laid out the entire story. The law student and me took over completely. I presented the case logically, chronologically, starting with the manipulated quitclaim deed, the initial fraud. I described the confrontation, the discovery of the drug paraphernalia in the shoebox, and finally, the typewritten letters detailing the $1 million debt to what was clearly a drug trafficking organization. I didn't cry, I didn't raise my voice. I presented the facts as if I were delivering a case brief to a panel of judges. When I finished, Miller leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, slow breath. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice a low gravel, "this is a hell of a situation you're in." He looked at me with a newfound respect. "You did the right thing by coming to us." "The smart thing." He explained that the letters I described were consistent with a mid-level trafficking group they'd been trying to get a handle on for months. My parents weren't just users. They were mules, couriers, caught in the machine. "We can't just go in and raid the house based." "On your testimony," he explained, his tone shifting from sympathetic to professional, They'll liar up, the evidence will be circumstantial, and the big fish we're really after will scatter. To build a solid case, one that sticks to them and helps us climb the ladder to their suppliers, we need more. We need incontrovertible proof. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. I knew what was coming next. What kind of proof? We need evidence of ongoing criminal activity, he said, his eyes holding mine. Recorded conversations about the debt, about their next delivery, marked bills changing hands. We need someone on the inside. He let the words hang in the air for a moment. We need you, Caria. The room felt suddenly airless. It was. One thing to make the abstract, agonizing decision to report my parents. It was another thing entirely to become the instrument of their capture, to actively participate in their betrayal. The daughter who I thought I had buried at dawn screamed in silent protest. Miller must have seen the conflict on my face. No, this is an unthinkable thing to ask, he said, his voice softening slightly. But your parents are in over their heads with some very dangerous people. The longer this goes on, the higher the chance they end up dead. A prison sentence is starting to look like the best case scenario for them. By helping us, you're not just helping us build a case. You might be saving their lives. His words struck home, a cold, hard confirmation of my own terrible logic. He was right. This wasn't about punishment. This was about extraction. The next few hours were a surreal blur. I was moved to a more secure room where I met two other detectives. They explained the process, the risks. They fitted me with a small, discreet recording device, a wire. The feel of the cool metal being taped to my skin was a profound violation. A physical brand marking my betrayal. They gave me a stack of marked bills, $1,000, and instructed me on how to offer it to my parents for their immediate needs. A gesture that would seem natural coming from a concerned daughter. My instructions were simple, yet impossibly complex. Go home to my parents' home and act normal. I was to be the loving, worried daughter. I was to engage them, ask them how I could help, and let the recorder capture whatever came next. Every word of concern would be a lie. Every gesture of affection would be a calculated part of the sting. As I drove away from the station, the weight of what I was about to do pressed down on me, heavier than any grief I had ever known. I was no longer a civilian. I was an informant. I was a weapon aimed directly at the heart of my own family. I pulled up to the curb a block away from their house, the house I grew up in, and took a deep breath. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant, fiery strokes, a beautiful sunset for the ugliest day of my life. I reached under my shirt and felt the hard outline of the wire. Then, steeling myself, I put the car in drive and headed toward the Lion's Den. Walking through my parents' front door felt like crossing a hostile border into my own past. Every object was a memory, every shadow a ghost. But now a new sickening layer was added to it all, the faint weight of the wire taped to my skin. A constant chilling reminder of my purpose. The air was stale and thick with anxiety. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that I was sure the tiny microphone could pick up. My role was simple, to be the loving daughter. It was the most difficult performance of my life. I found them in the kitchen. My mother was staring into an empty coffee cup, her hands trembling. My father was on the phone, his voice low, urgent. Whisper. He hung up the second he saw me, a flash of paranoia in his eyes. Caria, he said, his voice attempting a casualness that was utterly unconvincing. Everything okay? I was worried, I said, forcing a warmth I didn't feel. The words felt like ash in my mouth. I wanted to see how you were. You both seemed so stressed earlier. This was a calculated risk, an opening to test the waters. My mother looked up, her eyes swimming with a desperate, unshed grief. It's just, things are complicated, honey. This was the moment. The daughter in me wanted to run. The law student had to act. I walked to the counter and pulled out the envelope Detective Miller had given me. It was thick with $1,000 in marked bills. "I know," I said, my voice soft. "I know things are hard. I've been saving money from my part-time job and scholarships. It's not much, but I want you to have it. Please let me help." I pushed the envelope across the counter. For a moment, they just stared at it. Then a wave of relief so profound it was almost grotesque washed over my mother's face. She began to cry, real tears this time. "Oh, Caria, you shouldn't have. We can't take your money." But her hand was already reaching for it. My father took the envelope, his fingers fumbling with the clasp. The sight of his gratitude was a physical pain, a twisting knife of guilt in my gut. This single act cemented my deception, buying their trust with bait provided by the police. It was a necessary cruelty, I told myself. This temporary relief for them was the price of preventing a catastrophic future. "We'll pay you back." "Honey, I swear," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. "As soon as this next shipment is done, we'll be clear. We can finally get clear." The word hung in the air. Shipment. It was the first piece of concrete evidence, the first confirmation for the silent listeners on the other end of my wire. "Shipment?" I asked, infusing my voice with the innocent curiosity of a daughter who is out of her depth. "What do you mean?" "I don't understand." My father waved a dismissive hand, but my mother, emboldened by the cash and her own emotional release, broke down. "It's this debt, Caria," she sobbed, sinking into a chair. "It just keeps growing. We thought we could handle it, just move a few things for them to work it off, but they just keep adding more. There's a delivery tomorrow night down at the old warehouse district by the river. If we're late or if it's short..." She trailed off, a shudder running through her dot. My father shot her a warning look, but it was too late. He sighed, a sound of utter defeat. "Your mother's right. We're trapped. The people we owe, they aren't like the banks. They don't send letters, they send people." This was it. The core of the case, unfolding in my childhood kitchen. I had to keep them talking. Every word they spoke was a brick in the wall of a prison cell, but it was also a brick in the barrier that would protect them from a violent end and stop this poison from spreading further into the community. The suffering this conversation would cause was contained. The suffering it would prevent was immeasurable. This was the cold, hard math I had to believe in. "Who are these people?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "Can't you just go to the police?" My father let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "And say what?" "That we owe $1 million to the Espinosa cartel for the drugs we lost. They'd kill us before we even made a statement. No, we do this one last job, deliver their package, and we get out. This is the only way. Espinosa cartel. Delivery tomorrow night, warehouse district." The details spilled out, each one a victory for Detective Miller and a deeper wound for me. I had done it. I had guided them, prodded them, and used their trust to make them confess to a federal crime on a hidden recorder. I stayed for another 20 minutes, making sympathetic noises while my soul screamed. Finally, I made an excuse about having to get back to my grandmother. The relief on their faces at my departure was palpable. They needed to plan. They had my money, and they had a job to do. The drive away from the house was a vacuum. The tension of the performance was gone, replaced by the hollow certainty of the outcome. I followed the protocol Miller had laid out, driving to a deserted parking lot 2 towns over. His unmarked car pulled up beside mine a few minutes later. I didn't look at him as I unhooked the wire and handed the small, warm device over to him. It felt like handing over my parents' lives. "You did good, Caria," he said softly. "You were great. We have everything we need. I just nodded, unable to speak. I had performed my duty. I had chosen the action that would, in the end, lead to the least amount of destruction. But as I drove away, leaving Detective Miller with a recording of my family's ruin, I had never felt less like a hero. I felt like an executioner. The consequences were in motion now, an unstoppable machine that I, myself, had switched on. Asterisk, the night of the arrest. I sat with my grandmother in her living room, the ticking of the grandfather clock counting down, the seconds to a life I couldn't yet imagine. I didn't tell her what was about to happen. There were no words to prepare her for it. We played a quiet game of gin rummy, the soft snap of the cards, the only sound in a world holding its breath. My phone, resting on the table beside me, was a silent black bomb dot at 10:47 p.m. It buzzed. The caller ID was a blocked number. It's done, Detective Miller's voice said, devoid of triumph. They're in custody. The package was recovered. It was clean. Are they okay? I asked, my voice a whisper. They're safe, Caria. That's what you wanted. He was right. I ended the call and looked across the table at my grandmother, who was smiling gently at her hand of cards. In that moment, the utilitarian calculus I had clung to felt like a flimsy shield against a tidal wave of grief. To keep her sitting, here, safe and smiling, I had just orchestrated the demolition of her daughter's life. The cost of protecting this sanctuary was devastatingly high. I excused myself, went to the guest room, and was quietly sick in the bathroom. There was no victory, only the sour taste of a necessary terrible choice. The days that followed were a blur of legal formalities. The for sale sign was removed from the lawn, a small but significant victory. I met with a sharp, tired-looking assistant district attorney named Miss Albright. She explained the situation with professional candor. The evidence I had provided, the recording, was airtight. It gave them immense leverage. Because of your cooperation, she told me, her office overlooking the city, we're able to offer your parents a deal. It's a substantial one. She explained the terms. In exchange for their full testimony against the Espinosa cartel's regional leadership, they would plead guilty to lesser charges. They would face prison time, yes, but not for the decades they could have. And most importantly, the sentence included a mandatory transfer to a federal medical facility for a minimum of 2 years of intensive, long-term drug rehabilitation. They won't just be inmates, Miss Collins, Miss Albright said, her gaze softening for the first time. They'll be patients. What you did, it didn't just give us a case. It gave them a chance. A chance. That was more than they had the day I found the shoebox. It was the best possible outcome born from the worst possible circumstances. The logic held. The pain I had caused was targeted and finite. The pain I had prevented would have been catastrophic. 6 months later, I drove to a medium security correctional facility 2 states away. It was a sterile, modern campus that tried hard to look more like a community college than a prison. But the fences and guard towers betrayed the truth. I was there. To see my parents, they walked into the visitation room together. The change was stunning. They had gained weight. The desperate, haunted look in their eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, profound sadness. The fog of addiction had lifted, and they were left to stare at the wreckage it had caused. They were sober, and for the first time in years, they looked like themselves, again older, broken, but undeniably themselves. The conversation was stilted, full of painful, unspoken things. We didn't talk about the wire or the arrest. We talked about the rehab programs. My father was working in the facility's workshop, his hands finding purpose again in sanding wood. My mother had joined a therapy group. Finally, as our time was ending, my mother looked at me, her eyes clear. We hated you for a while, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I think you need to hear that. I nodded, my throat tight. I know. But the counselors here? She continued, glancing at my father. They helped us see. We were on a train going 100 miles an hour off a cliff. There was no stopping it. You blew up the tracks. She took a shaky breath. It was a terrible, violent crash. But we survived. We wouldn't have otherwise. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a happy ending. It was something more raw and more real. An acknowledgement. A concession to a terrible necessity. Today, a year after it all began, the scent of gingerbread and cinnamon once again fills my grandmother's kitchen. We stand side by side at the counter, her hands, wrinkled and sure, guiding mine as we roll out the dough. The house is safe. The title is clear. Her future is secure. My parents are alive and sober, serving their time and paying their debt to society. The Espinosa cell they worked for has been dismantled. I did not save my family. I saved what was left of it. I made a choice that caused immense immediate harm to the two people who gave me life, but in doing so, I contained a raging fire. I protected my grandmother, I saved my parents from a certain grave, and I stopped a flow of poison into the world. It's a heavy knowledge to carry, one that will live with me forever. As I place a tray of gingerbread men into the hot oven, I understand that my sanctuary is not just a place of comfort anymore. It's a monument to survival, built on the ashes of a painful, calculated, and heartbreaking choice.